midsummer evening rather than in cold, dark February when our festival takes place. We are delighted to partner Peter and Martine Hauben, Sasha's publishers, on this occasion. Peter and Martine are founders and directors of the Hauben Press, a tablet magazine recently called the Hauben Press the best little publishing house in London. Many literary gems issued from their office at 22 Golden Square. Jewish Book Week has presented a number of their authors, and long may this partnership continue. And now to Sasha Abrahmsky. The House of 20,000 Books is a love story, a wonderful love story, devoted to his grandparents and a vanished world. Sasha has inherited his grandfather's idealistic vision. His other most recent book being The American Way of Poverty, How the Other Half Still Lives. After PPE at Oxford, he studied journalism at Columbia, moving eventually to California and now living in Sacramento. He teaches writing and has written 3 books on crime and punishment, which nicely brings me to Nick Ross. Nick Ross is Hampstead born and bred, although he did in fact begin his career in journalism and broadcasting in Belfast, reporting from the BBC on the Northern Ireland Troubles for 7 years. Moving on and up the BBC ladder, he graduated to reporting programs such as Man Alive, 60 Minutes, Watchdog, and eventually for 23 years, Crime Watch. Nick Ross has always been interested in crime, its issues, practitioners, causes, and victims. He has contributed to, championed, and shared many philanthropic causes, and is a tireless social action campaigner, both on and off the screen. There is a mystery attached to it this evening, which I hope that he and Sasha will resolve, and that is, how come he's chairing an event on Shimon Abrahmsky? What was the nation of him? What was the character of his acquaintanceship with Shimon Abrahmsky? So I look forward to them resolving this mystery for us. And now, a little video.
Five Mill Way, the house that my grandparents lived in, was one of the most important places in my life. Every weekend I'd go there. My granddad would open the door. He'd kiss me on both cheeks. He spoke this patois of English and Russian and Yiddish and Hebrew. And he'd bring me in, and he'd just absorb me into the conversations in the house. After my granddad died in 2010, I tried to piece together their lives. The result is my book, The House of 20,000 Books. It's a detective journey, a story that takes readers from the 1880s in the Russian Empire, when my great-grandfather, Sasha Abrahmsky, became one of the great rabbinic figures of the modern world. And I imagine it was quite similar to the journey that Edward de Vere took when he wrote The Hare with Amber Eyes. But this voyage going back into my own ancestry, trying to understand their lives. My grandfather was born in Minsk in 1916, just before the Russian Revolution. 93 years later, he died in London. In the nearly 100 years that he lived, he built up one of England's finest collections of old books. He was a historian of socialist literature and of modern Jewish history. In middle age, my grandfather was discovered by the great philosopher Isaiah Berlin and ended up teaching first at Oxford and then as a professor of modern Jewish studies at University College London. He roamed the world. He was looking for all of the epicenters of the Jewish story: Israel, Russia, England, Spain. Later in life, he went back and forth across the Atlantic. He became one of Sotheby's great manuscripts experts. Shimon was absolutely a polymath. Anything to do with the world of ideas fascinated him. I found photographs of my grandmother leading demonstrations in the East End of London in the 1930s, calling for more benefits to be paid to the unemployed. She was an extraordinary hostess. While my granddad used words to create a fabric of existence for his life, so my grandmother used cooking. She opened up their house to thousands of people, and it was that combination of obsessive book collecting and obsessive people collecting that made Five Mill Way one of the most unique houses in London. This is
very extremely rare. This is the first biography of Marx, 1817, 5 years before he died. Extremely rare, not even in the British Library.
The house looked totally nondescript from the outside. It just looked like an ordinary suburban house. And you'd step inside this wonderland, and it was literally floor to ceiling of books. Every room apart from the bathrooms had books. The airing closets had books. The floors were piled with books and manuscripts. You could find Karl Marx's membership card of the First International. You could find handwritten documents with Lenin's handwriting or Karl Marx's handwriting on it. You could go into another room and you find a first edition René Descartes. You find just this wondrous set of posters and artwork bound into a series of volumes from the Paris Commune from 1871.
Oh my God. This is just brilliant. This is obviously the Kaiser. Bismarck is taking the Republic's flag to the Kaiser, who is bathing in blood, having crushed the French.
The thing is, when I was a kid, I took all of this for granted. It just seemed normal. And then as I got older, I realised how extraordinarily rare this was. And that my granddad had actually amassed a collection that wasn't just large, but the quality of the collection. This really was a lifelong project.
You've got more than the British Library.
The first edition. When I was a student in Jerusalem, there were cheap editions of Marx, and I had not much money. So whatever money I had, I already began to buy books, especially of Marx. He opened my eyes to how to understand history, his sharpness of style, writing in English, in German, in French, brilliant, absolutely brilliant in all these three languages, captured my imagination.
Of the 20,000 books in my granddad's house, I'm sure he had read almost every single one of them. He was like a human Google. One of his favourite intellects of all time was Spinoza. He'd read passages from it, and he would use them as morality tales. I must have been the only kid in London who was being quoted Spinoza as a morality tale. When my dad was a child, back when my grandparents were communists, all the top communist historians would come through, Eric Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill, and they would debate issues into the small hours of the night. How do we find meaning in our lives? Do we find it in the printed word? Do we find it in the great gatherings that bring family and friends of all generations together? As I wrote The House of 20,000 Books, I wanted to convey all of that majesty and all of that mystery to my readers. I wanted to invite them into that house. I wanted them to feel what it was like to sit at that dining room table and to engage in those conversations. And I hope that as you read this book, you feel that at least in some small way, you have become a part, a guest of Five Hill Lane.
Well, this is Sasha's evening, not mine, but I've been asked to explain what I'm doing here and why, and what my relationship is with Sasha and with the subject of the book. When I came back to London from Belfast, my best friend, somebody very quickly became my best friend, was Sasha's cousin, Jenny. And when I, aunt rather, my God, yes, Aunt Jenny. And when, I'm showing my age, and when she took me back to meet her parents, I was greeted, as was everybody in a way, as though it was the most natural thing in the world that I was part of the family. But even if I hadn't known Shimon and Mimi, even if I hadn't known the author of the book, once I started reading it, and I must confess I was quite reluctant to do this because it was a book that was worth reading, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to embarrass either of us by chairing a debate on a book I didn't much like. I was absolutely swept into it, and I genuinely believe that this book rivals the Hail the Amber Eyes. It is remarkable, and it's remarkably, beautifully written book. But it's also about remarkable. And tell us, first of all, Sasha, about Five Hill Lane, just as a house, because you've modeled the whole thing about what's on the building, on the house.
Yeah, because I was trying to work out a way to tell the story of the lives of Shimon and Mimi, of my grandparents. And Mimi lived to be 80, and Shimon lived to be into his 90s. He lived to be 93. And their story travels the 20th century.
And it's this massive story of ideological battles and searches for meaning, religion, secular ideologies, and nationalism and internationalism, all of these great quests for ideas. And the story was huge. And as a writer, I was sort of wrestling with how do I tell this story in a way that's going to bring a reader who doesn't already know them into their lives. And after a while, I realized that because the house was so unique, because there really were 15 to 20,000 books in this house, that if you wanted to understand them, you had to go on a journey through the rooms of the house, because each room represented different interests and different time periods and different groups of people. And what I mean by that is if you went into that house, and I know a lot of people in this audience, maybe most people in this audience, at some point or another found their way to Five Hill Way, you came into this house and it looked like it was completely ordinary on the outside. It was just a suburban North London house, and there are probably 100,000 or 500,000 houses that looked like that on the outside. And you got the steps, you ring the doorbell, and this little man opens the door, and he's 5 foot tall, and he's got this completely impossible to mimic accent. This combination of Yiddish and Russian and English and Hebrew and God knows what else, all mixed together. And then you look around and you realize that you can't see any wall space. What you see is pile upon pile of books. It's like going to the Grand Canyon and seeing these sort of strata of rocks, except it was strata of ideas. And the more you got trusted, the more you got absorbed in, 2 things happened. The first is that Mimi would feed you, and she'd feed you in different rooms. If it was just a casual visit, she'd take you into the kitchen and you'd get a cup of tea and some cake and some biscuits and more tea and some herring and bagels. But after a while, you got invited to the dining room. And then you got to experience 10 or 20 people and this extraordinary conversation. And then you'd come back a few more times, and eventually Shimon would trust you enough to start showing you his books. And it was like a dog licking your hand. It was a symbol of trust, that if Shimon showed you a book, took it off his shelf and explained to you its significance, it meant you become a part of Five Hill Way. And to me, that's what the house was. It was this combination of food and conversation and books, and I've never experienced anything like it anywhere else on earth.
It was absolutely obvious that Mimi was a brilliant cook. It wasn't obvious that Shimon could conceivably know where all these books were, what they were. There was a higgledy-piggledy absolutely everywhere, and yet, as you point out, he could find any passage of any book in the house.
Well, it wasn't just that he could find any passage of any book. He knew where the books were, he knew where the footnotes in the books were that had the references that he needed. And in between the books, he stuffed piles of letters, because he was one of, in addition to being a book collector, he was one of the great letter writers and letter receivers of his generation. So he had these correspondence going on with Isaiah Berlin and with the economist Pierre Schaffer, with great rabbis and great thinkers around the world, and he would use those as citations as well. So I don't know how he did it. I've never met anybody else like that, but when I was researching the book, I talked to one of his proteges, a man called Steve Zipperstein, who's at Stanford University, and he said that when he was studying here as a doctoral student, he'd go to the British Library, and he'd come back to the house and he'd do a test. He would sort of give a few clues, sort of talk about what he'd been watching, what he'd been looking at that day in the library. And he'd see how long it would take Shimon to work out what piece of material he was talking about. And he said, usually within about 10 seconds, Shimon would say, yes, you're talking about this newspaper published in Leningrad in this year, and he'd get it exactly right. And Steve said that it reminded him of a mnemonic trick that rabbinic students, yeshiva students in Russia, learned about 120 years ago, that they would literally learn where every citation in a document was, and they could stick a pin in, and they could work out by how far the pin had gone in, they could work out what page it was on, and tell you what the citation was. And they got it right. And Shimon's father, Yehezkel Abrahmsky, had gone through those yeshivas, and I think Shimon had picked up some of the mnemonic tricks, but it certainly was kind of like a magician's country trick that he would perform.
It was like an idiot savant, but he was no idiot. I mean, on the contrary, what was extraordinary is he didn't just know where everything was, but he could somehow integrate all the meanings. make an extraordinary sophisticated discourse from one to another.
He could, and this is one of the things I was trying to do in my book. If you've got a library that has